Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some pretty interesting stuff today. From a 19th century scholar named Godfrey Higgins
Oh, wow. Okay.
and his book, Anacalypsis. Have you heard of this?
I have. It's quite a dense book.
Yeah, it's a bit of a deep cut. I mean, it delves into all sorts of things like comparative mythology and ancient history.
Mm-hmm.
And Higgins himself, he was a bit controversial back in the day.
Yeah.
But the excerpt that you sent over, I think it's really thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It focuses on the flood,
Mm-hmm.
fossils,
Right.
and ancient deities.
Okay.
So we're going to kind of try to uncover some of the surprising connections, I think, that he makes between like biblical accounts and all these global flood myths that we see all over the world.
Mm.
And then also look at his argument that the biblical flood that we hear about might not have been as worldwide or as recent as maybe we've been led to believe.
Yeah. It's fascinating because a lot of the ideas that he was exploring back then were really kind of on the fringe at the time. But I think now, with more modern research, people are starting to take a second look at some of his ideas.
It's like he was ahead of his time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's
Yeah.
start with his observations about fossils. He noticed something kind of peculiar. We find all these fossils, right, of extinct animals like giant elk, for example,
Mhm.
and elephants.
Yeah.
But there's no human fossils alongside them.
Right.
And that, I don't know, that just makes you think, why is that?
Well, and that's exactly what Higgins was getting at, right? He's like, why is there this discrepancy? And his argument was that points to the fact that humans came on the scene much later than these creatures, after these big catastrophic events that wiped these creatures out.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because that really challenges the timeline, right?
Yeah, it challenges the traditional timeline that we often hear about, right? And I think what's interesting too is that kind of aligns with what we know about modern geology, right? Like the Earth is vastly old.
Right.
Right. And human, the human presence on Earth is a very, very, very small sliver of that total timeline.
Like a blink of an eye.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So he was onto something, even way back then.
Yeah.
And he actually references Cuvier, who was quite a prominent paleontologist who believed in these multiple revolutions or extinctions in Earth's history.
Right.
Which kind of further supports Higgins' argument about humans arriving kind of on the scene much later.
Exactly. You would think that if we had been around at the time of these creatures, that there'd be some trace of us too.
Yeah.
But there isn't, which is quite interesting.
So then that leads us to the next kind of big question that he tackles, and that's the flood narrative.
Right.
Right. That's
Yeah.
in Genesis. And is it meant to be taken literally?
Yeah.
Right. Is this like a historical event that happened exactly as described?
Right.
Or could it be some kind of an allegory or a symbolic story that's encoding maybe a deeper knowledge?
Yeah.
I don't know. I've always wondered about that because there's so many ways to interpret like religious texts.
Absolutely. And even in Higgins's time, there was a lot of debate about the extent of the flood, right? Like
Yes.
how widespread was it? And Higgins, he really kind of dug into the original Hebrew text of Genesis and suggested that it may have been more localized than a global inundation.
Okay.
Like he quotes the text directly, and he says that it doesn't say that the surface of the whole globe was covered.
So it's not so clear-cut as maybe some people have understood it to be.
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. And this idea that there were events predating the flood is something that pops up quite a bit in Higgins' work. He sees evidence for it in biblical accounts, but also in the archaeological record, which brings us to the pyramids. So he actually cites another scholar named Gab, who makes this bold claim that the pyramids were built before a major flood.
Wow. Okay. I'm intrigued. How does he support that?
Well, he points to the depth of the sand that's surrounding the pyramids. He suggests that suggests a sudden and massive inundation,
Okay.
right? A flood event that would had to have occurred after the pyramids were already standing.
So that's pretty mind-blowing because that totally changes the timeline
It does. It really does.
of civilization, if that's the case.
Yeah. And does he go into any detail about like how much sand we're talking about here?
He does. So he actually calculated how much sand the ancient builders would have had to excavate if the pyramids were constructed on an already sandy surface.
Oh, wow.
And it's an astronomical amount.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to even imagine that.
So Gab is basically suggesting that human history is much, much older than we traditionally think.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that Higgins is trying to do in Anacalypsis, is he's questioning, like, all of our accepted timelines and pushing back on the idea that we've got it all figured out
Right.
when it comes to the past. Like he's looking for evidence of a more ancient past that may have been a lot more advanced than maybe we give it credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. He's kind of paving the way for us to rethink things.
I like that. Be skeptical.
Yeah.
Re-examine what we think we know.
Absolutely. And he doesn't stop there, right? He dives into mythology as well.
Okay.
And specifically the figure of Bacchus.
All right, I'm ready. So what about Bacchus?
Well, this is where he takes us on a global journey. He starts drawing these really interesting parallels between Bacchus and figures from other cultures like Krishna,
Oh, wow.
Osiris,
Okay.
and even Jesus.
Oh, wow. Okay. What kind of parallels are we talking about here?
So he points out all these shared details, like Bacchus had multiple births. He was connected to Mount Meru.
Okay.
He was also associated with the bull, just like the Egyptian Apis.
Okay.
And then get this, Bacchus was even given titles like Savior and Son of God.
Oh, wow. Okay, so are those titles common in other mythologies as well?
Yes, that's a great point. It's actually a classic example of what we call the dying and resurrecting God archetype.
Okay.
Right, which pops up in many different cultures, and I think it speaks to some of our deepest human hopes and anxieties.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure.
What's the significance of this recurring theme?
Well, I think the dying and resurrecting God, it symbolizes our anxieties about death and our yearning for renewal, right? It reflects our desire to kind of overcome mortality,
Right.
to find meaning and hope in the face of inevitable loss.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really fascinating because it makes you realize how connected we all are, even across cultures and centuries.
Yeah.
Through these shared stories and these anxieties about these big questions.
Exactly. Yeah. It really highlights the common threads that run through human storytelling and belief systems, no matter how different they might appear on the surface.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is amazing how, like, when you start to dig deeper, you see how all these seemingly separate things start to kind of weave together in these really unexpected ways.
Right.
It's like he's piecing together a giant puzzle, with pieces from history and archaeology and mythology all fitting together in these really surprising ways.
And he's not even done yet. Remember that name IAO that we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
He goes deep into analyzing that and finds that it's present in all sorts of different cultures. It's a fascinating rabbit hole in itself.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of those things that, like, at first it seemed like just like a random detail, but then it kept popping up over and over again.
Exactly. And he connects it to the Jewish name for God, Jehovah. It's like he's tracing the evolution of this name, this concept, across time and cultures.
Yeah, I mean, this is really making me rethink what I thought I knew about religious history.
Yeah.
And wasn't there another scholar, Kircher, who had some interesting thoughts on IAO as well?
Yes. Kircher, who was a Jesuit scholar, linked IAO to the sun.
Okay.
And found that it was used by Gnostics.
Right.
And other groups.
So here we have this name, IAO, appearing in all these different contexts, like sun worship, ancient deities, even the Jewish God. So, I mean, what does it all mean? Is Higgins trying to say that there's a direct link between all these traditions?
Well, that's where we have to be a little bit careful. Higgins, he often makes these really bold claims, and it's important to remember that he was working with a lot less information than we have available today.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So while that linguistic link is definitely intriguing, it doesn't necessarily prove a direct historical connection.
Right. So it's more about recognizing how ideas and even sacred ones can travel and be transformed as they move across cultures.
Exactly. Yeah, think of it like a game of telephone.
Okay.
Right? Like the core concept might remain, but the details, they shift and change as it's passed down through generations and across different geographical boundaries.
Yeah. No, it's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It really kind of helps to visualize that. And this whole this IAO connection reminds me of something else that Higgins was really interested in, and that was this possibility of a pre-flood civilization.
Great.
With advanced knowledge. Remember how Gabb theorized that the pyramids predated a major flood.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like Higgins takes that idea and really runs with it.
He does.
Yeah.
He really does. And it's one of the most captivating parts of his work. He suggests that maybe, there was this civilization before the flood that had this knowledge and this technology that we're only now starting to rediscover.
And that's such a tantalizing thought. Like, what if we weren't the first ones to build these incredible structures or develop these complex societies?
Yeah.
Like, what if there's this whole chapter of human history hidden beneath the waves?
Right.
Just waiting to be unearthed.
It really does spark the imagination, doesn't it? And while we may never have definitive proof, it's these kinds of questions that really drive exploration and discovery, right? It's that spirit of inquiry that Higgins really embodies throughout Anacalypsis. It's that desire to challenge those assumptions and to delve deeper into the mysteries of the past.
Yeah, he's like an intellectual Indiana Jones.
It really is.
Leading us on these adventures through these ancient texts and forgotten lore. And it's really amazing to me how many of his ideas, which, back then were considered kind of fringe or outlandish.
Yeah.
Now we're starting to kind of re-examine them and reconsider them in light of, new discoveries and new evidence.
That's a great point. His work is a reminder that knowledge is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
What was once dismissed as myth or speculation can sometimes become accepted fact as we gather more evidence and refine our understanding.
It makes you wonder, what other myths might turn out to have a kernel of truth to them.
Right.
But back to Anacalypsis, what are some of the key takeaways that you think are important for our listeners to kind of think about after this deep dive?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that it's important to question assumptions, especially when it comes to history and religious narratives.
Right.
Higgins encourages us to be open to multiple perspectives, to acknowledge the complexity of the past, and to avoid settling for simplistic explanations.
So it's not just about accepting everything that Higgins says as fact.
Right.
It's more about using his work as a springboard for our own explorations and critical thinking.
Precisely. Anacalypsis, it's not meant to be like a definitive answer key to the mysteries of the past.
Okay.
It's an invitation to think differently, to consider those alternative narratives, and to embrace the possibility that we still have a lot to learn about our own history.
Yeah, that's such a valuable lesson.
Yeah.
And I think it applies to not just ancient history, but how we approach knowledge in general, really.
Absolutely. And that's a great note to wrap up on. With that sense of wonder and a thirst for further exploration, perhaps this deep dive has kind of sparked a curiosity in you to pick up Anacalypsis and kind of embark on your own journey. Or maybe it's inspired you to explore comparative mythology in general.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole world of fascinating stories and ancient wisdom out there just waiting to be rediscovered. And as we've seen with Higgins, sometimes those old stories hold insights that are surprisingly relevant to our lives today.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we can look through these stories and see how people in other cultures and other times were asking the same questions about life and death and what it all means.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes me think of something else about Higgins' work. He was really interested in this concept of mythos.
Oh, yeah. I remember that term came up. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, sure. So we often think of myth as meaning something that's false.
Right, like a made-up story.
Yeah, exactly. But mythos is something a little deeper than that. It refers to the symbolic language of myths, the truths that they convey about what it means to be human and our place in the universe.
Okay, so it's more about seeing these stories not just as literal events, but as ways of understanding the human experience.
Yeah, exactly. Higgins, he believed that myths weren't just made up stories, but attempts to explain the mysteries of the universe and wrestle with these big questions that people have always asked.
I like that. I mean, it makes you want to go back and look at all those old myths and legends and see what other meanings might be hidden in there.
Exactly. And I think that's what Higgins would want us to take away from Anacalypsis, to be curious, to question what we think we know, and to appreciate the power of stories to connect us across time and cultures.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely opened up a whole new way of looking at history and mythology for me. It's been a wild ride. We've talked about everything from fossils and flood myths to Egyptian pyramids to ancient deities.
That's pretty neat.
And it's all connected through this this one fascinating, sometimes controversial scholar.
It really is a testament to thinking across different fields. Right. He didn't limit himself to just one area of study. He drew connections between all these seemingly different ideas. And in doing so, he uncovered all these patterns and possibilities that others had missed.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most interesting discoveries come from looking beyond those traditional boundaries of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great place to leave our listeners today.
Yeah.
With a sense of wonder and that thirst for exploration. Who knows what other amazing connections and mind-blowing insights are out there just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And maybe some of those discoveries will come from taking another look at scholars like Godfrey Higgins. His ideas, which were once considered so out there, they're now finding new meaning as we learn more about the past. So, until next time, keep those minds curious.